Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something quite different. A gentle drift through the dusty corridors of ancient Rome, where empires rose and fell, not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet rustle of poppy petals and the soft whisper of smoke curling through marble halls. We're exploring the forgotten Opium Wars of the Roman Empire, those slow, burning conflicts that unfolded not in a single dramatic campaign, but across generations of quiet addiction, political maneuvering, and the kind of gradual decay that makes empires crumble from within. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. It's the height of the Roman Empire, somewhere around the 2nd century CE. The Mediterranean is essentially a Roman lake. Legions patrol from Britain to Syria. Aqueducts carry fresh water to bustling cities. The Pax Romana has brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. But beneath this golden veneer, something darker is taking root. In the quiet corners of Roman society, in the private chambers of senators, and the backrooms of taverns, a new kind of warfare is beginning. Not the kind fought with shields and javelins, but one waged with tiny seeds and bitter smoke. The Romans, you see, had discovered something that would change their empire forever. Opium. That milky white substance extracted from the scarified pods of the poppy plant. They called it opium, from the Greek word for juice. And indeed, it was the juice of dreams, of pain relief, of escape from the harsh realities of imperial life. But it was also the juice of dependency, of slow decline, of empires that forgot how to feel pain and thus forgot how to grow strong. Now, you might be thinking, surely the Romans were too disciplined for such indulgences. These were the people who conquered half the known world through military precision and stoic virtue. How could a simple flower bring down what barbarian hordes could not? Well, that's exactly what makes this story so compelling. Because the Opium Wars of Rome weren't dramatic battles with clear winners and losers. They were quiet, insidious conflicts that played out in bedchambers and senate houses, in merchant stalls and military camps, slowly rewiring the very DNA of Roman civilization. The story begins, as many Roman stories do, with conquest. When Roman legions pushed into Asia Minor and beyond, they encountered civilizations that had been cultivating and using opium for millennia. The Sumerians called it the joy plant. The Egyptians used it in religious ceremonies and medical treatments. By the time Rome arrived on the scene, opium was already an ancient art. Its cultivation and preparation refined through thousands of years of human experimentation. At first, Roman physicians embraced opium as a medical miracle. Here was a substance that could dull the most excruciating pain, calm the most agitated mind, and provide peaceful sleep to those tormented by nightmares or insomnia. Roman military surgeons began carrying small vials of opium extract to treat wounded soldiers. The wealthy started using it to manage chronic ailments that came with age and privilege. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as we'll discover, was everything. But let's start at the beginning, with a man whose name has been largely forgotten by history, though his impact on the Roman Empire was profound. Marcus Cornelius Dolabella was a Roman general who served under Pompey during the campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was Dolabella who first brought systematic opium cultivation to Roman attention, not as a conqueror seeking to exploit a resource, but as a sick man seeking relief from what we might now recognize as chronic pain. Dolabella had been wounded during a skirmish near Damascus. An arrow had lodged deep in his shoulder, and though Roman surgeons had removed it, the wound had never properly healed. For months, he lived with constant grinding pain that made sleep impossible, and military command a daily agony. Local physicians introduced him to a brown resinous substance that, when dissolved in wine and consumed, made the pain simply disappear. For Dolabella, it was nothing short of miraculous. Not only did the opium eliminate his physical suffering, but it seemed to lift a fog from his mind. Colours appeared more vivid. Conversations became more interesting. Even the tedious business of military administration took on an almost mystical quality. He began to see patterns in troop movements that had previously escaped him. Strategic possibilities unfolded in his mind, like flowers blooming in fast motion. Naturally, Dolabella shared this discovery with his fellow officers. Within months, opium had spread through the upper ranks of the Roman military like a benevolent plague. Commanders praised its ability to help them think more clearly during long strategic planning sessions. Centurions found it invaluable for managing the stress of commanding unruly legions. Even the common soldiers began seeking out the substance, though for them it remained expensive and difficult to obtain. Back in Rome, news of this wonder drug spread through the social networks of the patrician class. Wealthy Romans began importing small quantities of opium, at first purely for medical purposes. Galen, the famous physician, wrote extensively about opium's therapeutic properties, recommending it for everything from headaches to melancholy. Roman pharmacists learned to prepare various opium preparations, mixing it with wine, honey, or other substances to create medicines that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness. The early adopters spoke of opium in glowing terms. It wasn't just pain relief they praised, but the drug's ability to enhance intellectual and creative pursuits. Poets claimed it helped them access deeper wells of inspiration. Philosophers found that complex metaphysical problems became suddenly clear after a few drops of opium tincture. Even senators began using small amounts before important debates, claiming it helped them speak with greater eloquence and insight. For a generation, opium remained the province of the educated elite. It was expensive, difficult to obtain, and generally used with the kind of careful moderation that characterized Roman approaches to most pleasures. The empire continued to expand. Trade flourished. The great building projects of the Antonine dynasty transformed Roman cities into marvels of architecture and engineering. If anything, this first generation of Roman opium users seemed to be performing at an even higher level than their predecessors. But substances that promise paradise rarely deliver it, without extracting a price. The first signs of trouble appeared not in Rome itself, but in the eastern provinces where opium was more readily available and therefore more widely used. Roman administrators stationed in Syria and Asia Minor began exhibiting strange patterns of behavior. Some became reclusive, neglecting their official duties in favor of long hours spent in private contemplation. Others became erratic, making impulsive decisions that seemed brilliant at first, but proved disastrous in execution. A particular case that caught the attention of imperial authorities involved Gaius Valerius Maximus, the Roman governor of Cilicia. Maximus had been appointed to his position based on an exemplary military record and a reputation for administrative competence. For the first 2 years of his governorship, he performed admirably, successfully negotiating trade agreements with local kingdoms and suppressing several minor rebellions with minimal bloodshed. Then something changed. Maximus began spending enormous sums from the provincial treasury on what he called philosophical research. He commissioned elaborate gardens filled with exotic plants, including extensive poppy cultivation. He hired teams of scholars to translate ancient texts on medicine and natural philosophy. Most concerning of all, he began holding elaborate dinner parties that could last for days, during which guests would consume various preparations of opium while engaging in what Maximus described as elevated discourse. At first, these gatherings produced what seemed like remarkable insights. Participants claimed to have solved complex mathematical problems, composed sublime poetry, and achieved unprecedented understanding of natural phenomena. Reports of these intellectual breakthroughs reached Rome and initially generated considerable interest among the educated classes. However, closer examination revealed disturbing patterns. The mathematical solutions, when reviewed by sober minds, proved to contain fundamental errors. The poetry, while emotionally powerful during the opium-influenced sessions, appeared pretentious and incoherent when read later. Most troubling of all, the participants in these gatherings began requiring increasingly frequent sessions to maintain their sense of intellectual clarity and emotional well-being. Maximus himself became almost completely dependent on regular opium consumption. Without it, he experienced severe physical discomfort, emotional distress, and what he described as an inability to think clearly. His administrative duties suffered as he devoted more and more time to managing his opium supply and organizing his philosophical gatherings. Tax collection became sporadic. Justice was delayed or ignored entirely. The carefully maintained relationships with local rulers began to deteriorate. When imperial investigators arrived to assess the situation, they found a province in slow decline. Roads were falling into disrepair. Public buildings showed signs of neglect. The Roman garrison, many of whom had been drawn into Maximus's opium experiments, had lost much of their military readiness. Local populations, sensing Roman weakness, were beginning to assert greater independence from imperial authority. The investigators' report sent shockwaves through the Roman administrative system. Here was concrete evidence that opium, for all its apparent benefits, could undermine the very foundations of Roman governance. The substance that had seemed like a gift from the gods was revealing itself as something far more dangerous. Yet even this disturbing evidence was not enough to prompt immediate action. The benefits of opium were too obvious, too immediate, and too addictive in their own right. Roman physicians argued that the problem lay not with the substance itself, but with its misuse. Surely, they contended, proper education and regulation could harness opium's benefits while avoiding its dangers. This optimistic assessment would prove to be catastrophically wrong. As news of opium's remarkable properties continued to spread throughout the Roman world, demand began to outstrip the limited supplies available through legitimate medical channels. Enterprising merchants saw an opportunity and began establishing more systematic trade networks to import opium from its traditional sources in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The economics of this trade were compelling. Opium was relatively light and compact, making it ideal for long-distance transport. It commanded premium prices among wealthy Romans who had heard tales of its extraordinary effects. Most importantly, customers who tried opium once almost invariably wanted more, creating a remarkably stable market demand. Initially, this expanding trade seemed like an unqualified success. Roman merchants established trading posts in key opium-producing regions. Local populations benefited from increased demand for their crops. Tax revenues flowed into imperial coffers. The Roman economy, already robust from centuries of conquest and trade, gained a new and highly profitable sector. But this economic expansion came with hidden costs that would only become apparent over time. As opium became more widely available, its use began spreading beyond the narrow circles of physicians and intellectuals who had originally championed it. Wealthy merchants discovered that small amounts of opium could help them maintain focus during long business negotiations. Roman matrons found that opium-laced wine provided relief from the social anxieties of managing complex households. Even slaves, when they could acquire it, used opium to escape the harsh realities of their condition. The spread of opium use created what we might now recognize as the world's first large-scale drug epidemic. Though Romans of the time lacked the conceptual framework to understand what was happening to their society, they saw only individuals making personal choices about their own well-being, not recognizing the larger patterns that were beginning to reshape Roman civilization. The first major crisis emerged in the port city of Brindisi, where opium had become so deeply embedded in daily commerce that the local economy began to reshape itself around its distribution. What started as a few merchant families importing modest quantities for medical use had evolved into something resembling a parallel financial system. Dock workers discovered they could earn more in a single night transporting opium than in a month of legitimate cargo handling. Ship captains found that vessels carrying opium commanded premium berthing fees and expedited customs processing, as local officials had developed their own relationships with the substance. Marcus Flavius Cordus, the Port Authority chief, initially welcomed this new trade. The tax revenues were substantial, and the merchants involved seemed respectable enough. They dressed well, spoke eloquently about the medical benefits of their products, and maintained the kind of social connections that suggested legitimacy. Cordus himself began accepting small gifts of opium-laced wine from grateful traders, finding that it helped him sleep better after long days managing the chaotic port operations. But within 2 years, Cordus barely recognized his own city. The orderly rhythms of legitimate trade had given way to something far more urgent and unpredictable. Ships would arrive at all hours, their captains demanding immediate unloading regardless of existing schedules. Warehouses that had once stored grain and olive oil were converted to secure opium storage, their contents worth more per square foot than gold. Most disturbing of all, the city's social fabric began to warp around this new economic reality. Traditional Roman values of moderation and civic duty seemed increasingly quaint to residents whose daily lives revolved around opium commerce. Shopkeepers closed early to attend opium-enhanced social gatherings. Craftsmen abandoned their trades to work as couriers in the opium distribution network. Even the local garrison showed signs of corruption, as soldiers discovered they could supplement their modest military pay by providing security for opium shipments. Cordus found himself presiding over a city that was simultaneously more prosperous and more unstable than ever before. Crime rates fluctuated wildly, with periods of unusual tranquility followed by eruptions of violence among competing opium distributors. Public works projects, funded by opium tax revenues, proceeded in fits and starts as workers and supervisors struggled with irregular attendance and fluctuating productivity. The situation in Brindisi was replicated in dozens of other Roman cities as the opium trade expanded. Each community developed its own particular relationship with the substance, but common patterns emerged everywhere. Traditional economic relationships gave way to new hierarchies based on access to opium. Social gatherings increasingly centered around communal opium consumption. Public officials found their decision-making influenced by their own opium use, or by pressure from opium-dependent constituents. Perhaps most insidiously, the very language Romans used to discuss their society began to change. Concepts like duty, honor, and civic responsibility, which had formed the bedrock of Roman identity for centuries, were subtly redefined. Duty became the obligation to ensure adequate opium supplies for one's family and community. Honor was measured by one's ability to host sophisticated opium-enhanced gatherings. Civic responsibility meant protecting the trade networks that brought prosperity to Roman cities. These linguistic shifts reflected deeper changes in Roman consciousness. The Stoic philosophy that had long guided Roman ethics emphasized acceptance of pain and discomfort as natural parts of human existence. Opium offered an alternative philosophy, one that suggested suffering was optional, that human consciousness could be improved through chemical intervention, that the natural state of existence was perhaps inferior to what could be achieved through careful pharmaceutical enhancement. The conflict between these worldviews played out in countless individual Roman lives. Traditional Romans watched in dismay as friends and family members embraced what seemed like a fundamentally different approach to existence. Opium users, meanwhile, pitied those who remained trapped in what they saw as unnecessarily limited states of consciousness. This philosophical divide had profound political implications. Roman governance had always depended on a shared understanding of civic virtue, on the assumption that citizens would prioritize collective welfare over individual pleasure. But opium use encouraged a more individualistic worldview. one that valued personal experience and private satisfaction over public duty. The Senate began to notice these changes when legislative sessions became increasingly difficult to manage. Senators who had consumed opium before debates spoke with unusual passion and creativity, but often seemed disconnected from practical political realities. Their speeches, while eloquent and emotionally moving, frequently addressed abstract philosophical questions rather than the mundane business of governing an empire. More concerning were the senators who appeared unable to function effectively without regular opium consumption. These men, many of them distinguished veterans of military and administrative service, began exhibiting signs of what we would now recognize as withdrawal symptoms when deprived of their usual doses. They became irritable, unfocused, and prone to making impulsive decisions that they later regretted. The emperor, Marcus Aurelius, himself a philosopher of considerable reputation, initially approached the opium question with characteristic intellectual curiosity. He commissioned studies of the substance's effects, consulted with physicians and scholars, and even experimented with small doses himself. His personal writings from this period reveal a man grappling with the fundamental questions that opium raised about human nature and social organization. In his private meditations, Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the tension between individual suffering and collective welfare. Opium, he observed, could eliminate personal pain, but might weaken the social bonds that held Roman civilization together. If citizens no longer experienced the discomfort that motivated civic engagement, if they could retreat into private worlds of enhanced consciousness, what would happen to the public sphere that had made Rome great? These philosophical concerns became practical problems when opium use began affecting the Roman military. Legions stationed in opium-producing regions showed declining combat effectiveness, not because soldiers were intoxicated during battles, but because the rhythms of military life had been disrupted by widespread drug use. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to opium-enhanced rest found normal sleep inadequate. Officers who relied on opium to manage stress became less capable of making quick decisions under pressure. The most serious military incident occurred during a relatively minor campaign against Germanic tribes near the Rhine frontier. The 22nd Legion, many of whose members had developed opium dependencies during a previous deployment in Syria, found themselves cut off from their usual supply lines during an extended march through hostile territory. Within days, significant numbers of soldiers were experiencing withdrawal symptoms that severely compromised their fighting ability. The legion's commander, Lucius Antonius Rufus, faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to continue the campaign with a force of questionable reliability, or he could abort the mission and retreat, potentially exposing other Roman positions to enemy attack. Rufus chose to press forward, believing that Roman discipline would overcome any temporary difficulties. The resulting battle was a disaster. Roman soldiers, weakened by withdrawal symptoms and unable to coordinate effectively, were routed by a Germanic force they should have easily defeated. Hundreds of legionnaires were killed or captured, and valuable military equipment fell into enemy hands. More damaging still, news of the defeat spread rapidly through the Germanic tribes, encouraging further resistance to Roman expansion. The Rhine incident forced imperial authorities to confront the reality that opium use had become a strategic vulnerability. Military effectiveness, the foundation upon which Roman power ultimately rested, was being compromised by a substance that many Romans had come to see as essential to their well-being. Yet even this military disaster was not sufficient to prompt decisive action against the opium trade. Too many powerful Romans had developed financial or personal stakes in its continuation. Merchants argued that restricting opium would damage Roman commerce and reduce tax revenues. Physicians maintained that the substance's medical benefits outweighed its risks. Even ordinary citizens, many of whom had incorporated opium into their daily routines, resisted suggestions that their personal choices were somehow threatening the empire. The debate over opium policy revealed fundamental divisions within Roman society about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Traditional conservatives argued that Roman virtue required the acceptance of pain and discomfort as natural parts of existence. Reformers contended that Roman greatness lay in the empire's ability to adopt beneficial innovations from conquered peoples, regardless of their origins. This philosophical deadlock allowed the opium trade to continue expanding even as its negative effects became increasingly apparent. Roman cities developed distinct opium subcultures with their own social hierarchies, behavioral norms, and economic systems. These subcultures operated parallel to traditional Roman society, sometimes intersecting with it, sometimes conflicting with it, but always influencing it in ways that were difficult to predict or control. The empire found itself fighting a war unlike any it had previously encountered, a conflict that could not be resolved through military conquest or diplomatic negotiation, but required fundamental changes in how Romans understood themselves and their relationship to pleasure, pain, and civic duty. The war was being fought in bedchambers and bathhouses, in marketplace negotiations and family gatherings. It was a conflict where the enemy wore the face of relief, where victory felt like defeat, and where surrender masqueraded as enlightenment. The Romans, masters of conventional warfare, found themselves utterly unprepared for a battle that attacked not their bodies, but their very conception of what it meant to be human. As opium use spread through the middle classes, new social rituals emerged that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations of Romans. The traditional evening meal, once a time for family discussion and civic reflection, transformed into elaborate ceremonies centered around the consumption of opium-laced delicacies. Wealthy households competed to create the most sophisticated opium preparations, mixing the substance with exotic spices, rare wines, and imported honeys. These dinner parties became theatres of altered consciousness, where participants believed they were engaging in profound philosophical discourse, while observers noted increasingly disconnected rambling and grandiose pronouncements. The conversations, recorded by slaves who served as scribes, reveal a fascinating glimpse into minds convinced of their own enhanced brilliance while producing thoughts that ranged from the banal to the bizarre. Marcus Vinicius Calvus, a prominent merchant who hosted some of Rome's most fashionable opium gatherings, kept detailed records of what he called elevated conversations. His archives, discovered centuries later, provide a window into how opium was reshaping Roman intellectual life. Guests at his dinner parties claimed to have solved ancient mathematical puzzles, composed epic poetry on the spot, and achieved mystical insights into the nature of the gods. Yet when these accomplishments were examined in the clear light of day, they invariably proved to be illusions, the products of minds convinced of their own enhancement, but actually operating at diminished capacity. The tragedy was not simply that these Romans were deceiving themselves, but that they were losing the ability to distinguish between genuine achievement and drug-induced fantasy. The careful empiricism that had built Roman engineering marvels, the practical wisdom that had created effective legal systems, the disciplined thinking that had conquered half the world, all of this was being replaced by a kind of dreamy self-satisfaction that felt profound but produced nothing of lasting value. Children growing up in opium-using households began to exhibit strange developmental patterns. They learned to associate adult behavior with the ritualized consumption of mysterious substances, developing an early understanding that ordinary consciousness was somehow inadequate or incomplete. These children often displayed precocious sophistication in social situations, having observed countless hours of adult interaction under chemical influence, but they struggled with the kind of sustained attention and delayed gratification that had traditionally characterized Roman education. The effects extended beyond individual families into the broader educational system. Roman schools had always emphasized memorization, discipline, and the development of character through exposure to hardship. But students whose parents used opium regularly began arriving at school, with different expectations about learning and achievement. They had been raised in environments where insight appeared to come through chemical revelation, rather than through study and practice. Teachers found themselves dealing with students who became restless and dissatisfied when required to engage in the slow, methodical work that genuine learning required. These young Romans had been conditioned to expect the kind of immediate gratification and enhanced experience that opium provided, making them ill-suited for the patient cultivation of knowledge and skill that had always been the foundation of Roman education. The problem was compounded by the fact that many teachers themselves had begun using opium, convinced that it enhanced their ability to understand complex texts and communicate sophisticated ideas. Classrooms became spaces where both instructors and students operated under the influence of a substance that created the illusion of enhanced learning while actually undermining the cognitive processes that made genuine education possible. Roman military academies, traditionally the most rigorous and disciplined educational institutions in the empire, began reporting similar difficulties. Young men arriving for military training often came from families where opium use was common, and they struggled with the physical and mental demands of soldier life. The harsh realities of military discipline, the acceptance of discomfort and pain as necessary parts of training, seemed almost incomprehensible to youths who had grown up believing that suffering was optional and that consciousness could be improved through pharmaceutical intervention. More troubling still was the discovery that some military instructors had begun using opium to cope with the stress of training increasingly difficult recruits. These instructors believed that the substance helped them maintain patience and emotional equilibrium during challenging teaching situations. But their opium use created a subtle shift in military culture, as the stoic acceptance of hardship that had always characterized Roman military training was gradually replaced by a softer, more accommodating approach that prioritized comfort over character development. The cumulative effect of these changes was a generation of young Romans who were fundamentally different from their ancestors. They were often more articulate, more emotionally expressive, and more open to novel experiences. But they were also less resilient, less capable of sustained effort, and less willing to sacrifice personal comfort for collective benefit. The very qualities that had made Rome a dominant force in the ancient world were being systematically eroded by a substance that promised to make life easier and more pleasant. Religious institutions faced particular challenges as opium use spread through Roman society. Traditional Roman religion emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the acceptance of divine will, even when that will manifested as suffering or hardship. But opium offered an alternative spiritual path, one that suggested divine connection could be achieved through chemical means, rather than through moral discipline and ritual observance. Mystery cults, always present at the margins of Roman religious life, began incorporating opium into their initiation ceremonies and sacred rituals. These cults promised direct communion with the gods through carefully orchestrated drug experiences, attracting Romans who found traditional religious practices inadequate for their spiritual needs. The cults offered immediate transcendence, mystical insights, and profound emotional experiences that seemed more authentic and meaningful than the formal ceremonies of state religion. The established priesthood watched with growing alarm as attendance at traditional temples declined while participation in opium-enhanced mystery religions increased. The priests faced a dilemma that would resonate through subsequent centuries of human history. How could traditional spiritual institutions compete with substances that offered immediate access to transcendent experiences? Some priests attempted to incorporate opium into orthodox religious practices, arguing that the substance could deepen worshippers' connection to the divine. They pointed to ancient traditions of using various plants and substances in religious ceremonies, suggesting that opium was simply a more effective tool for achieving spiritual goals that had always been central to Roman religion. But other priests recognized that opium-induced religious experiences, however profound they might feel to participants, were fundamentally different from the kind of spiritual development that traditional religion sought to cultivate. The discipline of regular prayer, the practice of moral reflection, the gradual cultivation of virtue through repeated acts of service and sacrifice. All of this was incompatible with the immediate gratification that opium provided. The debate within Roman religious institutions reflected broader questions about human nature and spiritual development that opium use had raised throughout society. Was the goal of religion to make people feel better about their lives, or was it to help them develop the character and resilience necessary for genuine spiritual growth? Could chemical enhancement of consciousness lead to authentic spiritual insight, or did it merely create convincing illusions of transcendence? These questions became more than theological abstractions when Roman military campaigns began incorporating religious ceremonies designed to ensure divine favor for upcoming battles. Priests who used opium in their rituals reported receiving more vivid and detailed messages from the gods, communications that seemed to provide specific strategic guidance for military commanders. Initially, some of these opium-enhanced divinations appeared remarkably successful. Battles were won, territories conquered, and enemies defeated in ways that seemed to confirm the accuracy of drug-influenced prophecy. Military commanders began requesting priests who specialized in opium-enhanced divination, believing that such priests provided superior access to divine wisdom. But over time, patterns emerged that suggested the apparent success of opium-enhanced religious practices was largely coincidental. The detailed divine messages that priests reported receiving under the influence of opium often contained strategic advice that was either obviously correct, completely vague, or demonstrably wrong. When military campaigns succeeded, commanders credited the opium-using priests. When campaigns failed, the failures were attributed to other factors. More significantly, the reliance on drug-enhanced divination began to undermine the practical military planning and intelligence gathering that had always been the true foundation of Roman military success. Commanders who became convinced that opium-using priests could provide supernatural strategic guidance began to neglect the careful reconnaissance, logical analysis, and contingency planning that had made Roman armies so effective. The result was a series of military disasters that, while not as dramatic as the Rhine incident, collectively represented a significant decline in Roman military effectiveness. Armies led by commanders who relied heavily on opium-enhanced divination showed decreased strategic flexibility, poorer tactical decision-making, and reduced ability to adapt to unexpected battlefield developments. The irony was that opium, which had initially seemed to enhance Roman capabilities in so many areas, was gradually revealing itself as a source of systematic weakness. The substance that promised to make Romans more intelligent was making them less capable of sound reasoning. The drug that offered emotional relief was undermining the emotional resilience that had always been central to Roman character. The chemical that appeared to enhance spiritual insight was actually disconnecting Romans from the practical wisdom that their traditional religious practices had been designed to cultivate. Yet, perhaps the most insidious effect of widespread opium use was its impact on Roman attitudes toward truth itself. The substance created such convincing illusions of enhanced perception and understanding that users gradually lost the ability to distinguish between genuine insight and drug-induced fantasy. Romans who had built their civilization on careful observation of the natural world, systematic analysis of cause and effect, and practical testing of ideas against reality, were increasingly accepting beliefs and conclusions that felt true under the influence of opium but had no basis in actual experience. This erosion of epistemological standards had profound implications for Roman governance, military strategy, economic planning, and social organization. Decisions that should have been based on careful analysis of evidence were instead guided by insights that seemed profound during opium-enhanced deliberations, but proved disastrous when implemented in the real world. The empire was slowly losing its grip on reality, not through conquest or natural disaster, but through the gradual substitution of chemically induced illusions for the hard-won practical knowledge that had made Roman civilization possible. The war against opium was ultimately a war for the Roman mind, and it was a war that Rome was losing one dose at a time. The effects of opium permeated even the most intimate aspects of Roman family life, transforming relationships that had remained stable for generations. Roman marriages, traditionally built on mutual respect, shared duty, and the practical necessities of managing households and raising children, began to take on an entirely different character when one or both partners regularly used opium. Marcus Aurelius Severus, a successful olive oil merchant from Baetica, provides a telling example of how opium could reshape marital dynamics. Severus had begun using small amounts of opium to manage chronic back pain that had developed after years of supervising heavy cargo loading. His wife, Claudia, initially supported his use of the substance, grateful to see her husband free from the constant discomfort that had made him irritable and difficult to live with. But as months passed, Claudia noticed subtle changes in their relationship. Conversations that had once focused on practical matters like business decisions, children's education, and household management increasingly centered around Severus's internal experiences and philosophical reflections. He would spend hours describing the insights he had achieved during his opium sessions, insights that seemed profound to him, but struck Claudia as disconnected from their actual life circumstances. More troubling was the way opium affected their physical intimacy. Severus reported that the substance enhanced his emotional connection to Claudia, making him feel more loving and appreciative of their relationship. But Claudia found these drug-influenced expressions of affection somehow hollow, lacking the genuine spontaneity and mutual recognition that had characterized their earlier intimacy. She began to feel like she was relating not to her husband, but to a chemically altered version of him. The couple's children picked up on these subtle shifts in their parents' relationship dynamic. They learned to time their requests and conversations around their father's opium use, recognizing that he was more generous and agreeable when under the substance's influence, but also less reliable in following through on promises made during those periods. The children developed a sophisticated understanding of adult inconsistency that would have been foreign to previous generations of Roman youth. Similar patterns played out in countless Roman households as opium use spread through the middle and upper classes. The substance didn't destroy families in dramatic fashion, but it gradually altered the quality of relationships, introducing elements of artificial emotion and chemical dependency that undermined the authentic bonds that had traditionally held Roman families together. Roman law, that magnificent system of jurisprudence that had evolved over centuries to address human conflict and social organization, found itself struggling to cope with the novel problems that widespread opium use created. Traditional legal categories seemed inadequate for addressing situations where citizens' decision-making capacity was regularly compromised by chemical influences they themselves had chosen to embrace. Consider the case of Gaius Fabricius Lucinus, a prominent senator who had developed such a severe opium dependency that he was unable to function effectively without regular doses. Lucinus had signed several important contracts while under the influence of opium, agreements that seemed reasonable to him at the time, but proved financially ruinous when examined by sober advisors. When he attempted to void these contracts on the grounds that his judgment had been impaired, he created a legal precedent that threatened to undermine the entire Roman commercial system. If citizens could claim that contracts signed while using opium were invalid, what would happen to the countless business transactions that had been conducted by Romans who regularly used the substance? How could courts distinguish between legitimate impairment and mere buyer's remorse? The legal system, which depended on the assumption that citizens were responsible for their actions and decisions, struggled to adapt to a world where personal responsibility was complicated by chemical influences. Judges found themselves making increasingly arbitrary distinctions between acceptable and unacceptable levels of opium influence. Some ruled that small amounts of opium, used for medical purposes, did not invalidate legal agreements. Others maintained that any use of consciousness-altering substances created grounds for questioning the validity of contracts and testimony. The resulting inconsistency in legal rulings created uncertainty that began to undermine confidence in Roman law itself. Criminal cases presented even more complex challenges. When a Roman citizen committed a crime while under the influence of opium, how should the legal system respond? The traditional emphasis on personal responsibility suggested that individuals should be held fully accountable for their actions, regardless of their chemical state. But the obvious reality that opium significantly altered judgment and behavior made such strict accountability seem harsh and potentially unjust. The case of Lucius Domitius Calvus illustrates the difficulties Roman courts faced. Calvus, a respected businessman with no previous criminal record, had killed a slave during what witnesses described as an opium-induced rage. Under traditional Roman law, the killing of a slave by his owner was not necessarily criminal, but the circumstances suggested that Calvus had acted with unusual brutality and without the rational calculation that Roman law assumed even in cases of slave punishment. The court faced several difficult questions. Had Calvus's opium use made him temporarily insane? And if so, should he be held responsible for actions committed during that state? Could the regular use of opium be considered evidence of ongoing mental impairment that affected his legal status? Most fundamentally, how could Roman law maintain its emphasis on personal responsibility while acknowledging the reality that opium use compromised citizens' ability to make rational decisions? The judges ultimately decided to hold Calvus fully responsible for his actions, reasoning that he had chosen to use opium and therefore should accept the consequences of decisions made while under its influence. But this ruling created problems of its own, as it seemed to suggest that any Roman who used opium regularly was assuming legal liability for all actions taken while chemically impaired. The cumulative effect of hundreds of such cases was a gradual erosion of legal certainty that had been one of Rome's greatest achievements. Citizens could no longer be confident about how their actions would be evaluated by the courts, especially if those actions involved any connection to opium use. This uncertainty discouraged commercial activity, complicated family relationships, and undermined the social trust that had always been essential to Roman civilization. Perhaps nowhere were the effects of the opium crisis more clearly visible than in the gladiatorial games, those spectacular displays of combat that had become central to Roman popular culture. The games had always served multiple functions. They provided entertainment for the masses, demonstrated Roman military prowess, and offered a controlled outlet for the violence that was an inherent part of imperial society. But opium began to infiltrate even this most Roman of institutions in ways that fundamentally altered its character and social function. Gladiators themselves started using the substance initially as a form of pain management for the injuries that were inevitable in their profession. Trainers found that small amounts of opium could help fighters recover more quickly from wounds and continue training despite chronic pain. However, the effects extended far beyond simple medical applications. Gladiators who fought under the influence of opium displayed different combat styles, often more reckless and dramatic than their unimpaired counterparts. They seemed less concerned with defensive tactics and more willing to engage in the kind of spectacular, high-risk maneuvers that audiences found thrilling. Spectators began to develop preferences for opium-influenced fighters, not because they were more skilled, but because they provided more emotionally intense entertainment. The crowds could sense something different about these gladiators, a quality of desperate intensity that made their performances feel more authentic and compelling. This audience preference created economic incentives for gladiatorial schools to encourage opium use among their fighters. Promoters discovered that advertising enhanced gladiators could command higher ticket prices and attract larger crowds. What had begun as a medical intervention gradually became a performance enhancement technique that transformed the fundamental nature of gladiatorial combat. The change was subtle but profound. Traditional gladiatorial contests had been displays of skill, training, and tactical intelligence. Fighters were expected to demonstrate the martial virtues that made Roman soldiers effective: discipline, strategic thinking, and controlled aggression. But opium-enhanced gladiators offered something different: raw emotion, spectacular risk-taking, and the kind of transcendent intensity that audiences found addictive. Roman spectators began attending the games not just for entertainment, but for the vicarious experience of chemical enhancement that watching opium-influenced fighters provided. The crowds developed an almost mystical connection to gladiators who seemed to be operating at levels of consciousness unavailable to ordinary humans. This shift in audience expectations gradually transformed the entire gladiatorial industry. Schools began specializing in opium-enhanced training techniques. New forms of combat were developed specifically to showcase the altered consciousness that the substance provided. Traditional fighting styles, which emphasized technique and strategy, gave way to more spectacular but less skillful approaches that prioritized emotional impact over martial effectiveness. The long-term consequences were devastating for Roman military culture. The gladiatorial games had always served as a form of civilian military training, teaching audiences to appreciate the virtues of disciplined combat and strategic thinking. But the new opium-influenced style of gladiatorial performance taught entirely different lessons. That spectacular individual display was more valuable than tactical cooperation. That chemical enhancement could substitute for training and discipline. And that authentic human achievement was somehow inadequate compared to drug-enhanced performance. Young Romans who grew up watching these transformed gladiatorial games developed unrealistic expectations about combat and military service. They expected the kind of transcendent intensity that opium-enhanced gladiators provided, but were disappointed by the mundane realities of actual military training and warfare. Many sought out opium themselves, hoping to achieve the same kind of enhanced performance they had witnessed in the arena. The Roman military found itself dealing with recruits who had been culturally conditioned to expect chemical enhancement as a normal part of combat preparation. These young men struggled with traditional military training, which seemed boring and inadequate compared to the spectacular performances they had grown up watching. They had difficulty understanding why their commanders insisted on the slow, methodical development of basic military skills when opium seemed to offer a shortcut to the kind of transcendent warrior consciousness they had seen displayed in the games. The gladiatorial transformation reflected a broader cultural shift that was occurring throughout Roman society. Activities and institutions that had once been valued for their ability to develop character and practical skills were being reconceptualized as opportunities for enhanced experience and emotional intensity. The patient cultivation of excellence through practice and discipline was giving way to the pursuit of immediate gratification through chemical means. This change was perhaps most visible in Roman approaches to physical fitness and athletic training. Traditional Roman exercise emphasized functional strength, endurance, and the kind of physical conditioning that would be useful in military or civilian life. But as opium use spread, Romans began to seek out forms of physical activity that felt more intense and emotionally satisfying under chemical influence. Bathhouses, which had always been centers of social interaction and physical maintenance, began offering services designed specifically for opium users. Massage therapists learned to work with clients whose drug use had altered their sensitivity to touch and pressure. Bath attendants developed specialized techniques for helping opium-influenced customers navigate the complex social protocols of Roman bathing culture. Even the architecture of bathhouses began to change, with new designs that accommodated the altered spatial perception and social needs of chemically enhanced users. Private chambers became more common, as opium users often the traditional preferred intimate settings to communal bathing experience. Lighting was modified to create the kind of atmospheric effects that complemented opium-induced states of consciousness. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in how Romans understood the relationship between individual pleasure and social function. Traditional Roman culture had always emphasized activities that serve both personal and collective needs. Exercise that developed both individual fitness and military readiness. Social gatherings that provided both personal enjoyment and civic connection. Religious practices that offered both spiritual satisfaction and community cohesion. But opium use encouraged a more individualistic approach that prioritized personal experience over social function. Romans began to evaluate activities primarily in terms of how they felt rather than what they accomplished, leading to a gradual abandonment of practices that had traditionally maintained social cohesion and collective effectiveness. The economic implications of this cultural shift were enormous. Roman prosperity had always depended on citizens who were willing to engage in productive activities, even when those activities were not immediately gratifying. Farmers who planted crops they would not harvest for months. Craftsmen who spent years developing skills that would benefit their communities. Merchants who invested in trading relationships that would pay off over decades. All of these economic roles required the ability to defer gratification and work toward long-term goals. But opium use undermined the psychological foundations that made such economic behavior possible. Citizens who had grown accustomed to immediate chemical gratification found it increasingly difficult to engage in the kind of patient, systematic work that Roman economic success required. They began to seek out forms of employment that provided more immediate satisfaction, even when those jobs were less economically productive. The result was a gradual shift in Roman economic activity away from productive industries towards service sectors that catered to the desires of opium users. Traditional manufacturing, agriculture, and construction began to decline as workers gravitated toward jobs in entertainment, personal services, and opium-related commerce. This economic transformation created a vicious cycle that accelerated the spread of opium dependency throughout Roman society. As productive economic activity declined, Romans found themselves with more time and motivation to pursue chemical enhancement. As chemical enhancement became more widespread, the economic incentives for productive activity continued to diminish. The empire was slowly transforming from a civilization built on disciplined productivity into one organized around the pursuit of chemically enhanced experience. The change was gradual enough that most Romans did not recognize what was happening, but it was fundamental enough to threaten the economic foundations that had made Roman civilization possible. Military commanders stationed on the frontiers began reporting troubling changes in the quality of supplies and reinforcements arriving from the Roman heartland. Weapons showed signs of less careful craftsmanship. Armor was often poorly fitted and inadequately tested. Food supplies were sometimes contaminated or spoiled, suggesting problems in agricultural production and distribution networks. Most concerning of all were the replacement troops being sent to reinforce frontier legions. These soldiers, many of whom came from regions where opium use had become common, often lacked the physical conditioning and mental discipline that had traditionally characterized Roman military forces. They struggled with the harsh realities of frontier life, showed poor performance in training exercises, and seemed unable to adapt to the demanding rhythms of military service. Veteran centurions found themselves dealing with recruits who had fundamentally different expectations about military life than previous generations of Roman soldiers. These new troops expected forms of chemical assistance that were unavailable on the frontier, struggled with the physical discomfort that was an inevitable part of military service, and seemed incapable of the kind of sustained effort that effective soldiering required. The cumulative effect was a gradual decline in the effectiveness of Roman frontier defences at precisely the moment when barbarian pressures were increasing along the empire's borders. Germanic tribes, sensing Roman weakness, began testing frontier positions more aggressively. Parthian forces increased their raids into Roman territories. Even traditionally peaceful client kingdoms began asserting greater independence from Roman authority. The opium crisis had created strategic vulnerabilities that Rome's enemies were beginning to recognize and exploit. The empire that had once seemed invincible was revealing itself to be increasingly fragile, not because of external conquest, but because of internal decay that was slowly eating away at the foundations of Roman power. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire situation was that most Romans remained convinced that opium was making their lives better. The substance provided such immediate and obvious benefits, such clear relief from pain and anxiety, such apparent enhancement of intellectual and creative capabilities, that it seemed absurd to suggest it might be harmful. Romans who expressed concern about widespread opium use were often dismissed as reactionary traditionalists who failed to appreciate the benefits of pharmaceutical progress. The substance had become so thoroughly integrated into Roman culture that questioning its use seemed equivalent to questioning civilization itself. The war against opium was not being lost through military defeat or political failure, but through a gradual redefinition of what Romans considered normal, healthy, and desirable. The enemy had won not by conquering Roman territory, but by convincing Romans that surrender was actually victory, that weakness was strength, and that dependency was freedom. The empire continued to function, taxes were still collected, laws were still enforced, and legions still marched along Roman roads. But beneath this surface continuity, something fundamental had changed. Rome was no longer the same civilization that had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline, practical wisdom, and collective determination. The Opium Wars of the Roman Empire were being fought and lost in countless individual decisions, one dose at a time, as Romans gradually traded away the qualities that had made their civilization great in exchange for the promise of easier, more pleasant lives. It was a war unlike any other in human history, and its outcome would echo through the centuries that followed, as later civilizations grappled with the same fundamental questions about human nature, chemical enhancement, and the price of paradise that Romans had been unable to answer. The transformation wasn't sudden. It crept through Roman society like fog rolling in from the sea, so gradual that most Romans didn't notice until it had already enveloped everything they knew. By the 3rd century, what had once been a civilization built on the bedrock of stoic endurance had become something entirely different, though Romans themselves would have struggled to articulate exactly what had changed. Take the case of the Roman Senate during this period. Once the beating heart of republican virtue, where men like Cicero had thundered against tyranny and Cato had embodied uncompromising moral principle, the Senate now resembled something closer to a philosophical salon, where reality seemed optional. Senators would arrive for legislative sessions having consumed their morning opium preparations, convinced they possessed unprecedented clarity of thought and moral vision. The debates that ensued were unlike anything in Roman political history, where previous generations of senators had argued over practical matters like tax policy, military appropriations, and territorial administration. These opium-influenced deliberations wandered into abstract territories that would have baffled their ancestors. Senators spent hours debating the metaphysical nature of imperial authority, the cosmic significance of Roman destiny, and the spiritual implications of various policy proposals. Marcus Claudius Tacitus, a senator from Gaul who kept detailed records of these sessions, wrote with growing bewilderment about colleagues who seemed to inhabit a different reality entirely. Today, Senator Maximus spoke for 3 hours about the divine mathematics underlying grain distribution, he noted in his private journal. His arguments seemed profound during the session, yet when I reviewed my notes this evening, I could find no actual policy recommendations, only elaborate philosophical speculation that addressed no practical concerns. What made these sessions particularly surreal was the conviction of the participants that they were engaging in the most important and sophisticated political discourse in Roman history. Senators who had consumed opium before arriving would speak with passionate intensity about insights that seemed revolutionary to them, but appeared as meaningless abstractions to observers. They had lost the ability to distinguish between the feeling of profound understanding and actual comprehension. The legislation that emerged from these deliberations reflected this disconnection from practical reality. laws were passed that address problems that existed primarily in the imaginations of opium-influenced lawmakers. Complex regulatory schemes were implemented to manage economic relationships that bore little resemblance to actual commercial activity. Military appropriations were allocated based on strategic assessments that seemed brilliant during drug-enhanced planning sessions but proved disastrously inadequate when tested against real battlefield conditions. Perhaps most tellingly, the Senate began requiring increasingly elaborate procedures for conducting business, rituals that seemed designed more to accommodate the altered consciousness of opium-using participants than to facilitate effective governance. Sessions were scheduled at specific times that coincided with optimal opium effects. Special chambers were constructed with lighting and acoustics that enhanced the drug experience. Even the traditional toga was modified to include hidden pockets for carrying opium supplies. The Roman people, observing these changes from a distance, gradually lost confidence in their political institutions. Citizens who had once looked to the Senate for practical leadership and moral guidance found themselves governed by men who seemed to inhabit a different world entirely. The gap between ruling elites and ordinary Romans, always present in imperial society, became a chasm as opium use created an entirely separate class of chemically enhanced decision-makers. This political transformation accelerated when opium began affecting the imperial court itself. Emperors had always faced the challenge of managing competing factions, balancing military and civilian interests, and maintaining the delicate relationships that held the empire together. But opium introduced new complications that previous rulers had never encountered. Emperor Severus Alexander, who came to power in 222 CE, initially resisted pressure to incorporate opium into court ceremonies and decision-making processes. He had observed the effects of widespread drug use on political institutions and recognized the dangers it posed to effective governance. But as opium use spread through the aristocratic families that provided his key supporters, Alexander found himself increasingly isolated from the social networks that imperial power required. Courtiers who used opium regularly began to view the emperor's sobriety as a sign of intellectual limitation rather than moral strength. They whispered among themselves about Alexander's inability to achieve the enhanced states of consciousness that they considered essential for understanding complex political and spiritual questions. The emperor, they suggested, was trapped in an inferior form of awareness that made him unsuitable for leading a civilization that had evolved beyond such primitive limitations. The pressure became overwhelming when Alexander's own military commanders began using opium to manage the stress of frontier warfare. These generals reported that the substance helped them maintain emotional equilibrium during difficult campaigns and enhanced their ability to develop creative tactical solutions to military challenges. They began to question why their emperor refused to avail himself of a tool that could obviously improve his strategic thinking and decision-making capabilities. Faced with the choice between maintaining his personal principles and preserving his political effectiveness, Alexander eventually capitulated. His first opium experience, carefully orchestrated by court physicians and attended by his most trusted advisors, seemed to confirm everything his supporters had claimed. The substance appeared to clarify his thinking, enhance his emotional intelligence, and provide access to insights that had previously been unavailable to him. Within months, Alexander had become as dependent on regular opium use as any of his subjects. Court ceremonies were redesigned around the rhythms of imperial drug consumption. State business was conducted according to schedules that maximized the emperor's chemically enhanced capabilities. Even military campaigns were planned to accommodate the logistical requirements of maintaining the imperial opium supply. The transformation of the imperial court had cascading effects throughout the Roman administrative system. Provincial governors, eager to maintain favor with an opium-using emperor, began incorporating the substance into their own governing routines. Tax collectors discovered that opium helped them approach their often unpleasant duties with greater equanimity and creativity. Even military engineers reported that the drug enhanced their ability to envision and design complex construction projects. But these apparent benefits came with hidden costs that only became apparent over extended periods. Administrative efficiency, which had always been one of Rome's greatest strengths, began to decline as decision-making processes became more elaborate and less focused on practical outcomes. Simple problems that previous generations of Roman administrators would have resolved quickly became subjects for extended philosophical reflection and creative exploration. The Roman road system, that marvel of engineering that had connected the empire for centuries, began showing signs of neglect as maintenance crews struggled with the kind of systematic, unglamorous work that effective infrastructure required. Workers who had grown accustomed to opium-enhanced experiences found routine road repair boring and unsatisfying, leading to delayed maintenance and declining transportation quality. Similarly, the Roman postal system, which had enabled rapid communication across vast distances, became increasingly unreliable as postal workers and administrators prioritized activities that felt more meaningful under chemical influence. Messages that should have reached their destinations in days or weeks sometimes took months to deliver, creating communication delays that complicated everything from military coordination to commercial transactions. The cumulative effect of thousands of such small failures was a gradual erosion of the administrative effectiveness that had always been central to Roman imperial success. The empire continued to function, but with decreasing efficiency and reliability. Citizens could no longer count on government services that their ancestors had taken for granted, leading to a loss of confidence in imperial institutions that had once seemed unshakably competent. This administrative decline was particularly visible in Rome's relationship with its client kingdoms and allied territories. Roman diplomacy had always depended on the empire's reputation for reliable partnership and effective support for friendly rulers. But as opium use spread through the diplomatic corps, Roman foreign policy became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Ambassadors who negotiated treaties while under chemical influence often made commitments that seemed reasonable during drug-enhanced negotiations, but proved impossible to fulfill when examined by sober administrators. Client kings found themselves dealing with Roman representatives who spoke eloquently about grand strategic visions, but seemed incapable of addressing practical concerns about trade agreements, military support, or territorial disputes. The Kingdom of Palmyra provides a particularly clear example of how opium was undermining Roman diplomatic effectiveness. Queen Zenobia had initially been a loyal Roman ally, grateful for imperial protection against Persian expansion and appreciative of the economic benefits that came with Roman partnership. But her relationship with Rome began to deteriorate when she was forced to deal with a series of Roman governors who seemed more interested in philosophical discussions than practical governance. Governor Lucius Valerius Proculus, appointed to oversee Roman interests in the region, arrived in Palmyra convinced that opium had enhanced his understanding of Eastern cultures and religious traditions. He spent months organizing elaborate ceremonies that combined Roman administrative rituals with what he believed were authentic Eastern spiritual practices, creating hybrid events that satisfied neither Roman nor Palmyrene cultural expectations. More seriously, Proculus's opium-influenced negotiations with Zenobia focused on abstract questions about the nature of imperial authority and the cosmic significance of Roman Palmyrene cooperation, while ignoring concrete issues about trade routes, military coordination, and resource allocation that were essential to maintaining their alliance. Zenobia found herself dealing with a Roman representative who spoke passionately about philosophical concepts but seemed incapable of addressing the practical challenges that their partnership faced. The breakdown in Roman Palmyrene relations that followed was not the result of any fundamental conflict of interest, but rather the consequence of opium-impaired Roman diplomacy that had lost touch with the practical requirements of effective alliance management. Zenobia eventually declared independence from Rome, not because she opposed Roman rule in principle, but because she could no longer rely on Roman administrators to provide the kind of practical support and consistent policy that successful client relationships required. Similar patterns played out across the empire as opium use undermined the diplomatic and administrative competence that had traditionally maintained Roman hegemony. Client kingdoms that had been loyal for generations began asserting greater independence, not through dramatic rebellions, but through gradual disengagement from Roman systems that no longer functioned reliably. The economic consequences of this administrative decline were enormous. Roman commercial success had always depended on the empire's ability to provide stable currencies, enforce contracts, and maintain transportation networks that enabled long-distance trade. But opium-impaired administration gradually eroded all of these foundations of economic prosperity. Currency debasement, always a temptation for cash-strapped governments, became endemic as financially inexperienced officials made monetary decisions based on opium-enhanced insights that bore little relationship to economic reality. The silver content of Roman coins declined steadily as administrators convinced themselves that creative approaches to currency management could solve fiscal problems without requiring the kind of systematic reforms that effective economic policy demanded. Contract enforcement became increasingly unreliable as courts struggled to evaluate agreements made by parties who might have been under chemical influence. Merchants could no longer be confident that Roman legal institutions would provide consistent protection for commercial relationships, leading to a decline in long-distance trade and economic specialization that had always been central to Roman prosperity. Even taxation, the fundamental mechanism through which imperial government funded itself, became less effective as opium-using tax collectors struggled to maintain the systematic record-keeping and consistent enforcement that revenue collection required. Tax farming, always prone to corruption, became even more problematic when tax farmers were operating under chemical influences that impaired their judgment and encouraged grandiose but impractical schemes for revenue enhancement. The result was a vicious cycle in which declining administrative effectiveness reduced government revenues, which in turn limited the resources available for maintaining the administrative systems that effective governance required. The empire found itself trapped in a downward spiral where each administrative failure made subsequent failures more likely. Roman military effectiveness, the ultimate foundation upon which imperial power rested, suffered from similar patterns of opium-induced decline. The substance had initially seemed to enhance military performance by providing pain relief for wounded soldiers and helping commanders manage the stress of campaign leadership. But over time, the military consequences of widespread drug use proved devastating. Training standards declined as drill instructors struggled to maintain the kind of systematic, repetitive preparation that effective military education required. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to opium-enhanced experiences found basic military exercises boring and pointless, leading to poor discipline and inadequate preparation for actual combat conditions. More seriously, the complex logistics that kept Roman armies supplied in the field began breaking down as quartermasters and supply officers prioritized activities that felt more meaningful under chemical influence than the mundane tasks of inventory management and transportation coordination. Armies found themselves running short of essential supplies, not because resources were unavailable, but because the administrative systems that delivered those resources were no longer functioning effectively. The decline in Roman military effectiveness became apparent during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire faced simultaneous pressures from Germanic tribes, Persian expansion, and internal civil wars. Roman armies that should have been capable of handling these challenges found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by enemies who possessed inferior equipment and training, but retained the kind of disciplined focus and systematic organization that opium use had eroded from Roman military culture. The sack of Antioch by Persian forces in 256 CE provides a particularly clear example of how opium had compromised Roman military effectiveness. The city's garrison, commanded by officers who relied heavily on chemical enhancement for stress management, failed to maintain adequate reconnaissance and early warning systems. When Persian forces approached the city, Roman defenders were caught completely unprepared, not because they lacked sufficient troops or equipment, but because their command structure had become too disorganized and unreliable to coordinate an effective defense. Similar failures occurred throughout the frontier regions as Roman military units struggled to adapt to enemies who retained the kind of practical focus and systematic organization that had once characterized Roman forces. Barbarian tribes that had previously been held in check by Roman military superiority began achieving victories that would have been impossible against the disciplined legions of earlier centuries. The irony was that individual Roman soldiers often performed with remarkable courage and creativity during these engagements. Opium seemed to enhance their willingness to take risks and their ability to endure physical hardship during combat. But these individual heroics could not compensate for the breakdown in military organization and strategic planning that effective warfare required. Roman military culture had always emphasized the importance of unit cohesion, tactical coordination, and strategic discipline over individual martial prowess. But opium use encouraged a more individualistic approach that prioritized personal experience and emotional intensity over collective effectiveness. The result was armies composed of individually capable soldiers who could not function effectively as coordinated military units. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the changing character of Roman military leadership. Traditional Roman officers had been selected and promoted based on their ability to manage complex logistical challenges, maintain unit discipline, and execute strategic plans developed by higher command. But as opium use spread through the officer corps, different qualities began to be valued. Officers who could inspire troops through passionate speeches and dramatic personal example were promoted over those who excelled at the mundane tasks of military administration. Commanders who demonstrated creative tactical innovations during opium-enhanced planning sessions were given greater responsibilities than those who showed competence in basic organizational skills. The result was a military leadership that was often charismatic and emotionally compelling, but increasingly incapable of the systematic planning and careful execution that successful military campaigns required. Roman armies began to resemble collections of individually motivated warriors, rather than the disciplined military machines that had conquered the Mediterranean world. This military decline had profound implications for Roman society as a whole. The empire's internal stability had always depended on the assumption that Roman military forces could maintain order and protect against external threats. But as military effectiveness declined, Romans began to question whether their civilization possessed the strength and resilience necessary for long-term survival. Citizens who had once taken imperial protection for granted found themselves living with increasing uncertainty about their physical security and economic prospects. The psychological effects of this uncertainty were compounded by the widespread use of opium, which provided temporary relief from anxiety, but undermined the kind of practical problem-solving that effective responses to crisis required. The empire was caught in a trap of its own making. The substance that Romans had embraced to make their lives easier and more pleasant was systematically destroying their capacity to address the challenges that effective civilization required. Each dose of opium provided immediate relief from the anxiety and discomfort that declining imperial effectiveness created, but also contributed to the underlying problems that made such anxiety rational and appropriate. Romans found themselves living in a world where personal experience suggested that opium was beneficial, while collective outcomes demonstrated that its widespread use was catastrophic. The disconnect between individual perception and social reality became so extreme that most Romans lost the ability to recognize the relationship between their personal choices and the broader patterns of imperial decline. The Opium Wars of the Roman Empire were being fought and lost not on distant battlefields, but in the daily decisions of millions of individual Romans who chose temporary chemical relief over the long-term health of their civilization. It was a war unlike any other in human history, one where victory and defeat were measured not in territory conquered or lost, but in the gradual erosion of the cultural and psychological foundations that had made Roman greatness possible. As the 3rd century progressed, the consequences of this slow-motion catastrophe became increasingly difficult to ignore, even for Romans who had become accustomed to viewing their world through the distorting lens of chemical enhancement. The empire was transforming into something that would have been unrecognizable to the citizens, who had first embraced opium as a solution to life's inevitable sufferings. The war was entering a new phase, one where the enemy was no longer content with quiet infiltration, but was beginning to reshape Roman civilization so fundamentally that the very concept of Roman identity was becoming meaningless. The empire still existed on maps and in administrative records, but the culture that had created it was slowly dissolving in a haze of chemically induced illusions and systematically diminished capabilities. The next chapters of this story would test whether any remnants of traditional Roman strength remained hidden beneath the layers of pharmaceutical dependency, or whether the transformation had progressed so far that recovery was no longer possible. The answers would determine not just the fate of Rome, but the lessons that future civilizations would learn about the true costs of paradise. The transformation of Roman religious life under the influence of opium presents one of history's most fascinating examples of how chemical substances can reshape the very soul of a civilization. What began as isolated experimentation by curious priests gradually evolved into a complete reimagining of humanity's relationship with the divine, creating new forms of worship that would have horrified the stern ancestors who had built temples with their own calloused hands. The traditional Roman pantheon had always been a practical affair. Jupiter ruled with the same stern authority as a successful general. Mars embodied the disciplined violence that conquered nations. Minerva represented the careful wisdom that built aqueducts and legal codes. These were gods who demanded sacrifice, discipline, and the kind of stoic endurance that made empires possible. Their temples were austere spaces where citizens came to fulfill obligations, not to seek transcendent experiences. But opium offered a different kind of spirituality, one that promised direct communion with divine forces through chemical revelation rather than moral discipline. The first priests to experiment with opium during religious ceremonies reported experiences that seemed to validate everything Romans had always believed about their gods, but with an intensity and immediacy that traditional worship could never provide. Marcus Caecilius Pontifex, a respected augur who served at the Temple of Apollo in Rome, provides a detailed account of his first opium-enhanced divination session. Writing in his private journal, he described how the substance seemed to lift a veil that had always separated him from the divine presence he had served for decades. The god spoke not in symbols or omens, he wrote, but in direct communion, voice to voice, mind to mind, as clearly as I might converse with a fellow senator. The revelations that Pontifex received during these chemically enhanced sessions seemed remarkably specific and practically useful. Apollo provided detailed guidance about upcoming military campaigns, specific warnings about potential conspiracies, and even technical advice about temple construction and ritual procedures. For a priest who had spent years struggling to interpret ambiguous signs and cryptic omens, the clarity of opium-enhanced divine communication felt like a miraculous advancement in religious practice. Word of Pontifex's experiences spread rapidly through Roman religious circles. Other priests began experimenting with similar techniques, each discovering their own methods for combining opium use with traditional religious practices. The results seemed uniformly positive. Gods who had previously communicated through subtle signs now spoke with unmistakable clarity. Religious ceremonies that had once required careful interpretation now provided direct, unambiguous guidance. The Temple of Vesta, traditionally the most conservative of Roman religious institutions, initially resisted these innovations. The Vestal virgins had maintained the sacred flame for centuries through strict adherence to ancient rituals that emphasized purity, discipline, and unwavering attention to traditional forms. but even they eventually succumbed to the apparent benefits of chemically enhanced worship. Claudia Maxima, the chief Vestal during the reign of Septimius Severus, later wrote about the pressure she felt to incorporate opium into her religious duties. Priests throughout Rome reported receiving divine guidance that surpassed anything our traditional methods could provide, she explained. Citizens began questioning why the most sacred of Roman temples continued to rely on inferior forms of worship when superior alternatives were readily available. The transformation of Vestal practices occurred gradually. Initially, small amounts of opium were used only during the most important ceremonies, when the need for divine guidance was considered essential for Roman welfare. The substance seemed to enhance the Vestals' ability to maintain the sacred flame, providing them with insights about optimal fuel mixtures, ideal burning temperatures, and the subtle signs that indicated divine approval or displeasure. But as with every other aspect of Roman society touched by opium, religious use gradually expanded beyond its original boundaries. Ceremonies that had once been conducted monthly began occurring weekly. Rituals that had traditionally required only the chief Vestal now involved the entire order. Even routine temple maintenance began to incorporate opium-enhanced spiritual consultation, as the Vestals discovered that chemical revelation provided guidance about everything, from cleaning schedules to architectural modifications. The changes in Vestal behavior did not go unnoticed by the Roman public. Citizens who visited the Temple of Vesta began reporting strange alterations in the sacred flame itself. Some claimed it burned with unusual colors during certain ceremonies. Others insisted they could hear voices emanating from the fire when the Vestals were conducting their enhanced rituals. A few witnesses even reported seeing figures moving within the flames, divine presences made visible through the Vestals' chemically assisted spiritual practices. These reports created a sensation throughout Rome. Citizens who had always viewed the Vestal flame as a symbol of Roman permanence and divine favor now saw it as a gateway to direct spiritual experience. Crowds began gathering outside the Temple of Vesta during known ceremony times, hoping to witness the miraculous phenomena that opium-enhanced worship seemed to produce. The economic implications were immediate and substantial. Traditional Roman religion had always been a relatively inexpensive affair, requiring only modest offerings and occasional sacrificial animals. But opium-enhanced worship created new financial demands that quickly reshaped the economics of religious practice. Temples needed steady supplies of high-quality opium, which commanded premium prices in Roman markets. Special equipment was required to prepare and administer the substance safely during religious ceremonies. New categories of religious personnel emerged, specialists in opium preparation and ceremonial administration, who demanded compensation for their expertise. Even the architecture of temples began changing, as traditional designs proved inadequate for the altered consciousness that chemical worship produced. The Temple of Mars. Altar underwent extensive renovations during this period, adding private chambers where priests could conduct opium-enhanced consultations with individual citizens. The lighting was modified to create more dramatic visual effects during drug-influenced ceremonies. Even the acoustics were altered to accommodate the different vocal patterns that priests exhibited while under chemical influence. Citizens who could afford these enhanced religious services reported unprecedented spiritual satisfaction. The gods seemed more present, more responsive, more willing to provide the kind of specific guidance that practical Roman minds craved. Traditional religious practices, by comparison, began to seem primitive and inadequate, relics of a less enlightened era when Romans had been forced to worship through inferior methods. But these apparent spiritual advances came with costs that only became apparent over extended periods. The most serious problem was the way opium use affected the reliability of religious guidance. While chemically enhanced priests reported receiving more vivid and detailed communications from the gods, the practical value of this guidance proved questionable when tested against real-world outcomes. Military commanders who followed battle strategies received through opium-enhanced divination found themselves winning some engagements spectacularly while losing others catastrophically. The enhanced religious guidance seemed no more accurate than traditional methods, but its greater apparent certainty led to more extreme decision-making and less flexibility when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Commercial ventures blessed through chemically enhanced religious ceremonies showed similar patterns of unpredictable success and failure. Merchants who had once hedged their risks through diversified investment strategies began committing everything to single ventures that had received divine approval through opium-enhanced consultation. When these ventures succeeded, the results seemed to validate the superior spiritual insight that chemical worship provided. When they failed, the losses were often devastating. The problem was compounded by changes in how Romans understood religious authority itself. Traditional priests had always acknowledged the limitations of divine communication, emphasizing that gods spoke through signs and omens that required careful interpretation and humble recognition of human fallibility. But opium-enhanced priests claimed to receive direct, unambiguous divine communication that eliminated uncertainty and doubt. This shift from interpretive to revelatory religious authority had profound implications for Roman decision-making processes. Citizens who had once sought religious guidance as one factor among many in complex decisions began treating chemically enhanced divine revelation as infallible truth that superseded practical considerations or rational analysis. The case of Senator Gaius Asinius Gallus illustrates how this transformation in religious authority could affect even experienced political leaders. Gallus had built his career on careful political calculation, maintaining alliances with multiple factions and avoiding commitments that might prove disadvantageous if circumstances changed. But after consulting with an opium-enhanced priest about a crucial vote in the Senate, he received what seemed like unambiguous divine guidance to support a particular piece of legislation. The divine message, as reported by the priest, was remarkably specific. The gods had revealed not only how Gallus should vote, but why his support was essential for Roman welfare, and what rewards he could expect for his obedience to divine will. The certainty of this guidance was unlike anything Gallus had experienced through traditional religious consultation, where divine communication typically required extensive interpretation and careful consideration of multiple possibilities. Acting on this chemically enhanced divine revelation, Gallus committed his full political support to legislation that ultimately proved disastrous for both his career and Roman governance. The bill, which seemed brilliantly conceived during opium-influenced Senate debates, created administrative complications that took years to resolve and damaged relationships with key allied kingdoms that had previously supported Roman interests. Gallus's political downfall was not unique. Throughout the Roman political system, leaders who relied on opium-enhanced religious guidance found themselves making decisions that seemed divinely inspired but proved practically catastrophic. The substance that promised to connect Romans more directly with divine wisdom was actually disconnecting them from the practical intelligence and careful judgment that effective leadership required. The transformation of Roman religious life also affected the empire's relationship with foreign peoples and their spiritual traditions. Traditional Roman religion had always been remarkably inclusive, readily incorporating useful elements from conquered territories while maintaining core Roman values and practices. This religious flexibility had been one of Rome's greatest strengths, allowing the empire to govern diverse populations without requiring complete cultural assimilation. But opium-enhanced Roman priests began claiming access to spiritual insights that surpassed anything available through foreign religious traditions. The chemical revelations they received seemed so superior to conventional spiritual practices that Romans began viewing their own religious innovations as the culmination of human spiritual development, making traditional Roman religious tolerance seem not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful. This spiritual arrogance had immediate diplomatic consequences. Roman governors, who had once worked carefully with local religious authorities to maintain political stability, began demanding that subject populations adopt Roman religious innovations, including opium-enhanced worship practices. Local priests and spiritual leaders who had previously cooperated with Roman rule, found themselves pressured to abandon traditional practices in favor of chemical worship that violated their fundamental religious principles. The province of Egypt provides a particularly clear example of how Roman spiritual arrogance created political problems throughout the empire. Egyptian religious traditions, which had developed over millennia and commanded deep respect even among Romans, suddenly found themselves dismissed as primitive superstitions by Roman administrators who claimed access to superior forms of divine communication through opium use. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the Roman governor appointed to oversee Egyptian affairs, arrived in Alexandria convinced that chemically enhanced religious practices could solve the chronic administrative problems that had plagued Roman-Egyptian relations for generations. He immediately began implementing new religious policies that required Egyptian priests to incorporate opium into their traditional ceremonies, arguing that this would improve the accuracy of their spiritual guidance and make them more useful partners in Roman governance. The Egyptian priesthood, which had maintained unbroken religious traditions since before Rome existed, regarded these demands as sacrilegious violations of sacred practices that had sustained their civilization through countless political upheavals. Their resistance to Roman religious innovations was not based on ignorance or conservatism, but on profound spiritual convictions about the proper relationship between human consciousness and divine reality. When Egyptian priests refused to adopt opium-enhanced worship practices, Antoninus interpreted their resistance as evidence of spiritual inferiority rather than religious principle. He began replacing Egyptian religious authorities with Roman priests who claimed ability to provide superior spiritual services through chemical means. Traditional Egyptian temples were modified to accommodate Roman religious innovations, often destroying architectural features that had religious significance for local populations. The result was a religious uprising that quickly evolved into broader political rebellion. Egyptians who had previously accepted Roman rule as the price of political stability found themselves defending not just their political autonomy, but their spiritual identity against an occupying power that seemed determined to destroy everything they considered sacred. The Egyptian revolt was suppressed through military force, but its underlying causes remained unresolved. Throughout the empire, similar patterns played out as Roman spiritual arrogance created resistance among populations that had previously been content with Roman rule. The religious tolerance that had always been one of Rome's greatest imperial assets was being systematically destroyed by administrators who believed that opium had given them access to spiritual truths that made traditional religious diversity unnecessary. Even more troubling was the way opium use was transforming Roman understanding of religious truth itself. Traditional Roman religion had always emphasized practical outcomes over mystical experiences, judging religious practices by their effectiveness in maintaining social order, ensuring military success, and promoting economic prosperity. Gods were evaluated based on their utility, and religious innovations were adopted when they proved practically beneficial. But opium-enhanced religious experiences were so emotionally compelling that they began to be valued for their own sake, rather than for any practical benefits they provided. Romans started judging religious practices based on how they felt during chemically influenced ceremonies, rather than on their real-world effectiveness. The intense spiritual experiences that opium provided became more important than the actual guidance or assistance that religious practices were supposed to offer. This shift from utilitarian to experiential religious values had profound implications for Roman spiritual development. Citizens who had once approached religion as a practical partnership with divine forces began seeking spiritual practices that maximized emotional intensity and mystical experience. The careful balance between human effort and divine assistance that had characterized traditional Roman religion gave way to a more passive approach that emphasized chemical revelation over moral discipline. The transformation was visible in changing patterns of religious architecture and artistic expression. New temples were designed to enhance the visual and auditory effects of opium-influenced worship, with elaborate lighting systems, acoustic modifications, and decorative features that created spectacular sensory experiences during chemically enhanced ceremonies. Traditional Roman religious art, which had emphasized dignity, restraint, and moral instruction, was replaced by more emotionally intense imagery designed to complement and enhance drug-influenced spiritual states. Religious festivals, once occasions for community celebration and moral reflection, became elaborate spectacles focused on providing chemically enhanced, transcendent experiences for participants. The practical functions that religious ceremonies had traditionally served, reinforcing social bonds, transmitting cultural values and coordinating community activities, were subordinated to the goal of maximizing spiritual intensity through pharmaceutical means. Citizens who attended these transformed religious festivals reported profound spiritual satisfaction, but the festivals themselves became less effective at accomplishing the social and cultural functions that had made them important institutions in Roman life. Communities that had once been brought together through shared religious observance found themselves divided between those who embraced chemical spiritual enhancement and those who preferred traditional practices. The religious calendar itself began changing to accommodate the rhythms of opium use rather than the agricultural and social cycles that had traditionally structured Roman religious life. Ceremonies were scheduled to coincide with optimal times for chemical consumption, and the duration of religious observances was extended to allow full development of drug-influenced spiritual experiences. These changes reflected a fundamental transformation in Roman understanding of the relationship between human beings and divine reality. Traditional Roman religion had always emphasized that gods helped those who helped themselves, that divine assistance required human effort, and that spiritual development occurred through moral discipline rather than chemical intervention. But opium-enhanced religious practices suggested that authentic spiritual experience could be achieved through pharmaceutical means, that human effort was less important than chemical enhancement, and that the natural state of human consciousness was somehow inadequate for genuine communion with divine forces. This represented a complete inversion of traditional Roman spiritual values, one that had implications extending far beyond religious practice into every aspect of Roman culture and society. The empire was discovering that changing how citizens understood their relationship with the divine inevitably changed how they understood their relationships with each other, with political authority, with economic responsibility, and with the fundamental challenges that human existence required. The Opium Wars of Rome were being fought not just in the realm of politics and military affairs, but in the deepest foundations of Roman consciousness itself. As the 3rd century progressed, these spiritual transformations would prove to be among the most lasting and significant consequences of Rome's encounter with chemical enhancement. Long after political and military institutions had adapted to or recovered from the immediate effects of widespread opium use, the changes in Roman religious consciousness would continue to shape how citizens understood themselves and their place in the world. The war against opium was ultimately a war for the Roman soul, and it was a war that Rome was losing not through dramatic spiritual defeat, but through the gradual replacement of traditional religious wisdom with chemically induced illusions of transcendence. Each dose of opium provided immediate spiritual satisfaction while systematically undermining the religious foundations that had sustained Roman civilization through centuries of triumph and adversity. The consequences of this spiritual transformation would echo through the remaining centuries of Roman history, influencing everything from artistic expression to political philosophy, from military culture to family relationships. The empire that had once conquered the world through disciplined partnership with practical gods was slowly becoming something entirely different, a civilization organized around the pursuit of chemically enhanced spiritual experiences that felt profound but produced nothing of lasting value. The next phase of Rome's Opium Wars would test whether any remnants of traditional Roman spiritual wisdom remained strong enough to resist the allure of pharmaceutical transcendence, or whether the transformation of religious consciousness had progressed so far that recovery was no longer possible. The answers would determine not just the spiritual future of Rome, but the lessons that subsequent civilizations would learn about the true relationship between chemical enhancement and authentic spiritual development. The spiritual decay that opium brought to Roman religious life was merely the foundation for an even more profound transformation, one that would reshape the very fabric of Roman family structures and social relationships in ways that earlier generations could never have imagined. The institution of marriage, which had served for centuries as the bedrock of Roman social organization, began to warp under the influence of a substance that promised to enhance love, but actually destroyed the capacity for genuine human connection. Roman marriages had traditionally been practical arrangements designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously. They created economic partnerships that could manage property and resources efficiently. They established political alliances between families that strengthened the broader social network. Most importantly, they provided stable environments for raising children who would carry forward Roman values and traditions to the next generation. But opium introduced complications into marital relationships that Roman social institutions had never been designed to handle. The substance created artificial forms of emotional intimacy that felt more intense and meaningful than ordinary human connection, leading couples to devalue the quieter, more sustainable forms of affection that had traditionally sustained Roman marriages through decades of shared challenges and mutual support. Consider the case of Lucius Cornelius Balbus and his wife Livia Drusilla, a prosperous couple from Gaul who had maintained a stable and successful marriage for 15 years before either of them encountered opium. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and the kind of practical cooperation that made Roman households function effectively. They had raised 4 children together, managed extensive agricultural properties, and maintained the social connections that were essential for their family's continued prosperity. When Balbus first began using small amounts of opium to manage chronic pain from an old military injury, both he and Livia viewed it as a purely medical intervention. The substance provided obvious relief from his physical discomfort and seemed to improve his mood and energy levels. Livia was grateful from the constant pain that had made to see her husband free him irritable and difficult to live with for several years. But as months passed, subtle changes began appearing in their relationship dynamic. Balbus started describing his feelings for Livia in language that was more elaborate and emotionally intense than anything he had used during their previous 15 years of marriage. Under the influence of opium, he would speak passionately about his love for her, his gratitude for their partnership, and his vision of their future together. Initially, Livia found these declarations touching and reassuring. Her husband seemed more attentive, more emotionally available, and more appreciative of their relationship than he had been in years. But gradually, she began to notice that these expressions of enhanced affection occurred only when Balbus had consumed his opium preparations. During periods when he abstained from the substance, either by choice or due to supply interruptions, he reverted to his previous emotional patterns, treating her with the same respectful but restrained affection that had characterized their earlier relationship. This inconsistency created a disturbing new dynamic in their marriage. Livia found herself preferring the version of her husband that existed under chemical influence, while simultaneously questioning whether his drug-enhanced expressions of love represented his authentic feelings or merely pharmaceutical side effects. She began timing important conversations to coincide with his opium use, knowing that he would be more emotionally receptive and expressive during those periods. The situation became more complicated when Livia herself began experimenting with opium, initially as a way to better understand her husband's experiences, but eventually as a regular practice that she found emotionally and intellectually stimulating. The substance seemed to deepen her appreciation for their relationship, helping her recognize qualities in Balbus that she had previously taken for granted, and enhancing her emotional responses to his expressions of affection. Their marriage entered a new phase where both partners were regularly using opium during intimate conversations and shared activities. These chemically enhanced interactions felt more profound and meaningful than their previous relationship had ever been. They spoke more openly about their emotions, explored philosophical questions about love and partnership, and experienced levels of emotional intensity that seemed to validate everything they had always believed about their commitment to each other. But this apparent improvement in their relationship came with hidden costs that only became apparent over extended periods. The enhanced emotional experiences that opium provided began to make ordinary, unenhanced interaction feel inadequate and unsatisfying. Conversations conducted without chemical assistance seemed shallow and disconnected compared to the profound communications they achieved under drug influence. More seriously, their ability to handle practical relationship challenges began to deteriorate as they became accustomed to resolving conflicts through chemically enhanced discussions that felt more harmonious and productive than they actually were. Disagreements about household management, child-rearing decisions, or financial planning would be postponed until both partners could address them during opium-influenced sessions that seemed to produce perfect understanding and agreement. However, the solutions they developed during these drug-enhanced conversations often proved impractical or unrealistic when implemented in daily life. Their opium-influenced discussions generated elaborate plans for improving their relationship, managing their household more effectively, and raising their children with greater wisdom and compassion. But these plans were typically based on idealistic assumptions about human behavior and practical capabilities that bore little relationship to real-world constraints. The couple found themselves trapped in a cycle where ordinary relationship challenges accumulated because they seemed too mundane and unpleasant to address without chemical assistance, while their drug-enhanced problem-solving sessions produced solutions that were too unrealistic to implement successfully. Their marriage became increasingly dependent on regular opium use, not because the substance actually improved their relationship, but because they had lost the ability to function together without it. Their children observed these changes with the kind of intuitive understanding that young people often develop about adult inconsistencies. The 4 children learned to distinguish between their parents' natural emotional states and their chemically enhanced moods, adapting their own behavior accordingly. They discovered that requests for privileges or discussions of problems were more likely to be received favorably when their parents were under drug influence, leading them to time-important conversations strategically. This taught the children sophisticated but disturbing lessons about human relationships and emotional authenticity. They developed early understanding that adult emotions and expressions of affection might be artificial, that important decisions could be influenced by chemical states, and that the stability and reliability they craved from their parents might not be available without pharmaceutical intervention. The children also began to view their parents' enhanced emotional states as normal and desirable, creating expectations about adult relationships that would prove difficult to fulfill when they reached maturity themselves. They grew up believing that ordinary human emotions and natural forms of affection were somehow inadequate, that authentic love required chemical enhancement to reach its full potential. Similar patterns played out in thousands of Roman households as opium use spread through the middle and upper classes. The substance didn't destroy marriages in dramatic fashion, but it gradually altered the quality of marital relationships, introducing elements of artificial emotion and chemical dependency that undermined the authentic bonds that had traditionally held Roman families together. The effects extended beyond individual marriages into the broader social networks that connected Roman families. Traditional Roman society had been organized around extended family relationships, neighborhood connections, and social obligations that required sustained commitment and mutual support over long periods. These relationships depended on the ability of individuals to maintain consistent behavior and reliable emotional responses, regardless of their immediate feelings or circumstances. But opium use encouraged a more self-centered approach to social relationships that prioritized personal emotional satisfaction over collective responsibility. Romans who had grown accustomed to chemically enhanced social interactions found ordinary social obligations boring and unsatisfying, leading to a gradual abandonment of the community connections that had traditionally provided social stability and mutual support. The transformation was particularly visible in Roman approaches to hospitality and social entertainment. Traditional Roman dinner parties had been carefully orchestrated social events designed to strengthen relationships, exchange information, and maintain the complex networks of obligation and mutual support that held Roman society together. Guests were expected to engage in serious conversation about political and social issues, demonstrate their knowledge of literature and philosophy, and participate in the kind of intellectual discourse that reinforced shared cultural values. But as opium use spread through Roman social circles, dinner parties began to take on an entirely different character. Hosts discovered that providing opium-enhanced refreshments could create more intense and emotionally satisfying social experiences than traditional entertainment could offer. Guests who consumed these preparations reported feeling deeper connections with other attendees, more profound appreciation for the conversations, and greater satisfaction with the overall social experience. These chemically enhanced social gatherings seemed to produce exactly the kind of community bonding that Roman dinner parties had always been designed to foster, but with greater intensity and emotional impact than traditional socializing could achieve. Participants spoke more openly about personal matters, engaged more passionately in philosophical discussions, and developed what seemed like stronger friendships with other guests. However, the relationships formed during these opium-influenced social events often proved superficial and unreliable when tested by real-world challenges. The intense emotional connections that guests experienced under chemical influence did not translate into the kind of practical mutual support that genuine friendships required. People who had felt profound spiritual kinship during drug-enhanced dinner parties often discovered they had little in common and no basis for ongoing relationship when they encountered each other in ordinary circumstances. More significantly, the artificial intimacy that opium provided began to replace the slower, more gradual process of relationship development that had traditionally characterized Roman social life. Romans became accustomed to achieving immediate emotional connection through chemical means, making them impatient with the time and effort that authentic relationships required. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through the forgotten opium wars of ancient Rome, those quiet conflicts that unfolded not with the thunder of legions, but with the whispered promises of pharmaceutical paradise. Tonight, we've watched an empire slowly dissolve, not conquered by barbarian swords, but transformed by the very substance its citizens believed would make them stronger, wiser, more complete. The Romans discovered what countless civilizations would learn after them, that the most dangerous enemies often arrive wearing the mask of salvation, offering relief from pain while quietly stealing the capacity to endure it. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be deeper than the sleep that claimed an empire.